The next group of functions that we want to talk about are counting functions, and these are really, really helpful. So we're going to talk about 4 different count functions. Here we've got count, count A, distinct count, and count rows. And they all work in very similar ways. They just count slightly different things. So starting out with count, count is designed to find cells in a column that contain numbers specifically. All you do is write the count function, point it to a column containing values, and you're good to go. Count A is very similar, but this counts the number of non-empty cells in a column that could include numerical or text-based values. So syntax-wise, same deal here. Single argument for the column name. Now, distinct count, this is one of my favorites because it's such an easy way to determine the number of distinct values within a common, and there's honestly a lot of use cases for it. Simple syntax here, just one argument with column name. And then last but not least, we have count rows. And this one's slightly different because this actually points to a whole table or a table that's defined by an expression like filter or all and counts the number of total rows within that table. One thing that's important to note here is that a table within Power BI is considered either a single individual column or multiple columns. Right? So the table definition within Power BI is important to understand here when you're using something like count rows. So pretty clear, pretty straightforward. Let's head over to Power BI and we'll practice a couple of these in our AdventureWorks report. All right, so we're back in Power BI in the report view here. And what we're going to do is we're going to add 2 new measures in this lecture to practice some of these counting functions. And we're going to add measures for total returns and total orders. And one of the things that I've realized here is that this order quantity measure could be a little bit confusing based on what it's actually counting. So what I want to do here is I'm going to right click and click rename, and I'm going to call this quantity sold. So what this is doing is summing all of the values within the order quantity column, giving us the total quantity sold. So I think being a little bit more specific with our measure naming conventions is just going to help us really understand the purpose or what exactly each of these measures is doing. All right, so with that, let's start off with our total returns measure. And you can see here that we already have this measure for quantity returned, right, which is just the sum of the return quantity field. But in this case, I want to return the value of total returns. So it's a very similar concept to what we're counting here, but the difference is that if a customer came in and returned 2 items, that would count twice in the quantity return column. But if I only want to count that as 1 return, meaning that that customer came in and there was 1 transaction to return those 2 items, I need to look at counting this a little bit differently. And since our returns data table includes a record for every single return, what I can do here is simply count the number of rows to give me that total return value. All right, so to do that, we're going to use a count function. And here we're just going to add a new measure into the measures table. And we are going to call this total returns. And for this, we are going to use our count function. You can see here IntelliSense gives us all of the different counting functions available here. One of the other interesting things here too is if you're not quite sure what each one of these counting functions do, right? Like if you're not sure what count AX does, if you go over to the right-hand side here, you can click this read more, and Power BI actually gives you some context about each one of these functions, right? So count counts the numbers in a column, right? Count A counts the number of values in a column as well. But again, we talked about that being text and values within a column, right? So again, this is just a great way to get a little bit more detail about some of the different functions if you need it. So we're using our count function. And for this, what we want to base it on is the return quantity column, right? So here we're saying we don't want to sum the values within the return quantity column. We just want to count the rows or the records within that table, right? So we'll return down, we'll close out that parenthesis. And here we'll come up, make sure that we format this as we want. And again, feel free to update the formatting as you see fit as you're going throughout this course and project. And now let's add in our total returns field to our matrix visual. And I'll drag this here. And I'm going to collapse the category rows here, right? So we'll drill back up. And you can see that we're very, very similar between our total returns and our quantity returned, right? Again, and that's that difference. We're summing the quantity returned. There are some cases where a return contains multiple items, but that's not the purpose of this total returns measure. What we really want to understand here is how many return transactions there were, regardless of the number of items that were returned as part of that transaction. So, as an analyst, what this is telling me is that the vast majority of returns in this case were from single items, but there were a handful of multiple items returned, which is why the number is slightly lower than the quantity returned itself. Now, I want to go back to this concept that I mentioned earlier about each record within the return table representing a return. And I actually want to look at that table for a minute. So we'll head over here, right? So here we are looking at the returns table. And you'll note that in every single case, we've got a return date. We've also got a territory key, product key, and a return quantity associated with it, right? So there shouldn't be any blanks anywhere within this table. You can click on the column header here. You can see we've got values, 1 up to 10, our return dates, right? There's no null or blank values, so it would be populating at the top. So again, each row in this data set represents an individual return. So what this means is if I go back and we revisit our total returns measure, I could theoretically count this in a couple of different ways. Right now, we're looking at the count of the return quantity column. Right? What we could actually do is you could update this to count rows. Right? And then counting an individual column, we can count rows from the returns data table, right? We've got 1809 there on our total returns. We hit enter to lock this in. We get the same exact value, 1809. We could update this again to using something like count A, right? And we want to go back to our returns data. And this time, let's use the product key, right? So again, we want to count all of those values, all of those records within this table, the returns data table, and we still have that same 1809 value. So there you go. We've seen, a few different options and counting approaches to evaluate the same exact total returns measure. Now, it's up to you which version you'd like to use here. Personally, I'm going to use count, and we'll go back to counting the return quantity column. We'll close off our parentheses, clean up our DAX here, and enter to lock that in. Right? So hopefully that concept makes sense there, where the different counting functions ultimately are returning the same thing in this case. They're just approaching the counting methodology slightly differently. All right, and the next measure that I'd like to add, it's very similar to what we just worked through, but this time we're going to do it looking at the sales table. And I want to add a comparable measure here for total orders. And it's kind of the same story as using our quantity sold column. So for our quantity sold measure here, we had already defined this, right? We're summing up all of the order quantities, but for something like total orders, we're not really interested in the total quantity ordered. We're more interested in the total volume of orders as a whole, right? The total number of transactions that happened, right? So to figure out how we're going to calculate this, I think it's going to be helpful to go and first look at the sales table to really understand what's happening here. So we'll jump back over to the data view, click into the sales table. Looking at the sales data table, one thing that's interesting here is that we've got this order line item column. What this column is telling us is that if I placed a single order but purchased 2 different products, that'll show up as one order number in our order number column, but will be followed by multiple order line items, right? So it's saying that there's multiple order items within an individual order. And the reason that we're digging into this is because I can't use a function like count or count A against any of the columns within the sales table, because it won't respect the duplicates and I'll end up double counting and inflating my total orders. So this is a great opportunity to use that distinct count function, because what I ultimately want to do is count the unique order numbers, right? And that's going to give me my measure for total orders. So if we look down in the bottom here, when you click on one of these columns, Power BI actually will tell you the number of distinct values contained within that column, right? So this is kind of a good opportunity to understand that there's some places that you can kind of gut check or QA your measures after you create them. We've got 56,000 total rows within this sales table, but we've only got a little over 25,000 distinct order numbers. So just keep that in mind here. Let's head back and we're going to create this new measure for our total orders. Again, come back to our measure table here, new measure, again, total orders. Again, we're going to use our distinct count. And from here, we're going to use the order number column, right? So I can start typing in order and I have my order number column. I can hit tab to select that, shift enter, and then we'll lock this in, right? So now I want the distinct count of the order number column from my sales data table. And I'm going to format this, make sure we add my comma in there. And then let's add it into our visual. So come in here, measure table, total orders, and I'm going to move that just next to the quantity sold so we can see the difference there. What we're looking at is the, kind of total quantity sold here next to our total number of orders. Again, see our total here, 25,164. If I jump back to the data view and I select that order number column again, 25,164 distinct values. Right, so that gives us a great indication that we've created this measure appropriately and it's returning a value that we would expect or anticipate. So for me, this really highlights one of the most important things when you're creating measures within Power BI is really paying attention to the counting or aggregation methods that are used. As you can see, we have our quantity returned measure, which returns a different value than our total returns measure. The business question, or as an analyst, the questions that you're asking to derive these two values are very different, right? And understanding how to use Power BI to create measures to get at those questions is super important, right? And as you continue to develop reports and really get comfortable using a tool like Power BI and writing DAX, some of that stuff should feel a little bit more intuitive as you go along. So for now, there's just handy things to keep in mind. And with that, that's going to wrap up this lecture on some of your basic counting functions in DAX.